To trip or not to trip? That is the question.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the Student Sparks podcast, where naturopathy meets neuroscience. I'm Parker Malev, the naturopath.
And I'm Emma Johnson, the neuroscientist. Join us on this adventure as we delve into the depths of nutrition, nature, medicine, and the mind,
where every insight sparks discussion and debate.
In 2000, Johns Hopkins researchers were the first to obtain approval in the United States to do research with psychedelics in volunteers who had no previous experience with the drugs.
In 2006, one of the first publications said that psilocybin can occasion mystic-type experiences, having substantial and sustained personal meaning and spiritual significance. On the safety and enduring positive effects of a single dose of psilocybin is widely considered the landmark study that sparked a renewal of psychedelic research worldwide.
In 2014, Johns Hopkins researchers found that longtime smokers who had failed to drop the habit were able to after carefully controlled and monitored use of psilocybin in the context of CBT, known as cognitive behavioral therapy.
In 2016, a small double-blind study done by Johns Hopkins researchers reported that substantial majority of people suffering with cancer-related anxiety or depression found considerable relief for up to 6 months from a single dose of psilocybin.
In 2018, researchers pushed for psilocybin to be recategorized from a Schedule 1 drug, one with no known medical potential, to the Schedule 4 drug, such as prescription sleep aids, but with tighter control.
In 2019, an online survey of over 300 people with alcohol use disorder reported reducing or abstaining alcohol use after taking a psychedelic drug such as psilocybin, LSD, or DMT. This study adds to the growing evidence for supporting further investigation of psychedelic-assisted treatment for alcoholism and substance abuse.
Later that year, the Center for Psychedelic and Consciousness Research at Johns Hopkins Medicine opened.
In 2020, the brain scans after the use of psilocybin showed that colostrum was less active, meaning the area of the brain believed responsible for setting attention and switching tasks is turned down while on the drug. The researchers say that this ties in with what people report as the typical effects of psychedelic drugs.
Later that year, in a small study of adults with major depression, researchers found that psychedelic substance psilocybin produced rapid and large reductions in their symptoms, with most participants showing improvement and half of study participants achieving remission through the 4-week follow-up.
In 2021, Johns Hopkins Medicine was awarded a grant from the NIH, or the National Institutes of Health, to explore the potential impacts of psilocybin on tobacco addiction. This is the first NIH grant awarded in over half a century to directly investigate the therapeutic effects of a classic psychedelic, consistent with a recent study published online that searched NIH funding and found 0 grants were awarded between 2006 and 2020. Johns Hopkins Medicine will lead the multi-site 3-year study in collaboration with University of Alabama at Birmingham and New York University.
In recent years, psilocybin and other psychedelics have been shown to decrease depressive symptoms, anxiety symptoms, and other neural disorders. However, stigma around the drug has decreased the ability for continued research in the general population through long-term studies, halting the ability to gain more understanding of the drug and its impacts.
I don't exactly know why we felt immediately led to make that the most serious bit that we've ever been involved in our entire lives. But I hope you enjoyed it. Regardless, the topic is to trip or not to trip, and that's the question we're trying to answer today. So despite there being a lot of inconclusive and not accessible research, we did our best to kind of dig through the history, where we're at now, and where we think it should go with the use of psilocybin and other psychoactive drugs.
Our goal in this podcast episode is basically to take the research that is available and make it more accessible to people who don't always read research papers. So we went through a bunch of research papers and we dissected them, and we're going to talk about what they say, what that means, and what the impacts are, and then our own individual opinions about psilocybin and other psychedelic drugs.
Yeah, and stay tuned for the opinion part, because I'm going to say right up front that my original opinion of the quote-unquote drugs in general was hugely negative, hugely. And now I've, after reading through this, have transitioned to the more of, okay, this is legit. And I'm also a very natural-minded herbal health type person. And so I don't know why I never considered that things like this could be used in the same way that other herbs are. Just it has a little bit different stipulations because of the potential danger along with it. So
Mhm.
it's 100% necessary to look through this and understand it, especially because it's been on our legal ballots.
The first thing that we should talk about is what psilocybin and other psychedelic neuroactive drugs do to your brain. A recent paper in 2024 was able to localize acute anxiolytic action from serotonergic psychedelics to 5-HT2A receptors in the ventral hippocampus and specifically identified PV positive fast spiking cells as a cellular trigger for the psychedelic induced relief of anxiety like behavior. So that's like a lot of words. So I'm going to break down what each of
Emma.
them means and then give
English, Emma! English, Emma!
and then
I'm sorry,
give
I'm sorry.
like an overall of what it means in like English. So, acute anxiolytic action is acute anxiety relief. So it's talking about how the localization in the brain of acute anxiety relief from serotonergic psychedelics. Serotonergic psychedelics are the psychedelics that cause the activation of serotonin, which is like what some people call like the happiness hormone, like it makes you feel good, and also has other physiological functions. 5-HT2A receptors are a specific type of GPCR receptors, which, well, that's redundant. GPCR stands for G protein coupled receptors, and it's a specific G protein coupled receptor that belongs to the serotonin receptor family, which makes sense because it's a serotonergic psychedelic, which means it acts on serotonin receptors. This receptor family is associated with brain function, cardiovascular health, and neuropsychiatric disorders. So this is why psychedelics can have impacts on like broad parts of your physiological systems, from cardiovascular health to brain health. Okay, so PV positive fast spiking cells. These were the actual cells that they identified as the ones that are triggering the anxiety relief. And these cells are fast firing electrical activity GABA cells. So basically, what that means is that they really quickly activate GABA neurons. Okay, so GABA stands for gamma amino butyric acid. So it's a chemical in the brain that causes nerve firing.
Okay,
um,
my little bottle of it, if you buy it in the store, it says may promote healthy mood, relaxation, and stress support with little asterisks. And the little asterisk on there is everything that Emma just said. It calms your nervous system, helps you produce serotonin, relaxes you in general. And
mhm.
you produce more of it in the evening to help you go to sleep, kind of similar to how people take melatonin. It just does it in a different way. And that's what Emma is explaining here is the how of that, which is really important to understand because otherwise none of this stuff is ever going to get looked into.
So basically, these cells are what are causing the anxiety relief because GABA acts on serotonin cells and causes relaxation of the nervous system. So the overall understanding of this paper, like the actual in English, what this paper means, is that acute anxiety relief of serotonin acting psychedelics is localized to a G protein coupled receptor in the serotonin receptor family found in the ventral hippocampus. This anxiety relief is due to a cellular trigger of inhibitor neurons, the GABA neurons, that slow neural activity, allowing for a relief of anxiety like behavior.
So this sounds like 1 point for psychedelics. But
Yeah.
we got to consider that this does not consider long-term action. None of these studies are long-term studies. So just keep that in mind when you're reading through this is weighing the checks and balances of whether or not the action that it causes in the short term is worth the unknown of a long-term effect. It could do nothing in the long term. We looked up the duration of time it stays in your system and it's usually about 24 hours. I think we found. What
Hmm.
was it? Yeah, just
It's like alcohol. It
person
depends on
dependent.
your
Yeah.
person.
Yeah. So this is one of those things where it's how much damage can it do in that time, and we haven't measured that yet.
Yeah. And keep in mind, it is 2025 right now. The first group researchers to obtain regulatory approval, like we mentioned in the history section, was in 2000. So it's been only 25 years of studying the substance, which is very, very short in
Mhm.
medical science, like very, very short.
All right. So when we're talking about drugs in general, there's two things that come to mind with specific people, and it is usually hard drugs, crack cocaine, heroin, stuff you're shooting on the streets, or something that you're getting from a actual medical professional, a provider of sorts. And this one, ironically enough, kind of fits right in between those two, where most people think of it as one or the other, and there's no real in between yet. A survey looking into medical professionals and their knowledge and attitudes, concerns about psilocybin, and how it may affect people. Most of them believed that it has therapeutic promise and they're moderately open to use and support this kind of a drug. But there's low amounts of knowledge. Most of the providers themselves don't know much about it. They just know that there is an opportunity there, which by itself is reason to look into it. But we don't know the risks and we don't know the pharmacology of it. One of the major points of this and opinions of these providers is that when it's administered in a controlled setting is when these drugs show promising results. So it seems like the over-encompassing view right now of most professionals is that no, it's bad. We don't know anything about it. Or we don't know anything about it, but if we are given the opportunity to learn about it, then we can understand whether or not we should use it. And it has shown therapeutic effects underneath this controlled umbrella, especially in areas like mental health, such as depression, anxiety, PTSD, and substance use disorders, which seems ironic, but the calming effects of it seem to correlate with that as well. If only these people were given training. So my view right now is that providers should be trained to distribute this just as if they would any other commercialized drug. If you can go to your doctor and you can ask for anything you want and they can decide in their professional opinion whether or not they think you should have it. This seems to be one of those things where while we are still considering whether or not it's safe, that a doctor that a person confides in can help you determine whether or not that is true. That being said, they need to be educated and be allowed to be educated in these research settings. The survey gives light into their opinions and that it is an opening/emerging field of study that is important because we don't know much about it. Same thing goes with a lot of herbal medicine. There are thousands of years of accounts of people using it, and whether or not it works is 50-50, but if we don't look into it, we'll never know. You can't look at something and say, oh, it's 1,000 years old. That means it doesn't work. Or it's 1,000 years old. That means it does work. And I think that is kind of what this shows me here is that we need to look into it because people are interested. That's it. It can help. So why not look into something just because it has a stigma on top of it of being a hard street drug?
So we keep talking about how it has beneficial impacts and possible dangerous impacts as well. There have been surveys that show that people who use psychedelics have reported benefiting from the use, and others have reported having adverse outcomes. So, in a recent study in 2024, about 85% of respondents reported benefiting from the use, but 59% also reported, although benefiting or not benefiting, they did have adverse outcomes. A lot of people talked about how feeling more prepared in using psilocybin and confident in the reasons for use let them have less adverse outcomes because they trusted the medication and were able to work with a psychiatric professional to sort of open up and use it as a tool to access a part of their brain in order to heal from traumatic disorders. However, a lot of our research into psychedelics actually comes from surveys and other people saying whether or not they benefited and what were the adverse outcomes, or relying on surveys that say that they've used psychedelics and how that has impacted them over time. And that's not a medical trial. There are not as many medical trials as they are people just using statistics on surveys to see if there's correlation between things, which is fine. But again, that's still just a correlation. And using broad range surveys do not give us a more toned down version of what is impacting what and why, which is why actual medical research is important to understand what is actually happening instead of, oh, this might be causing this, or we see a correlation between this and this, but we're not 100% positive, or people say that it helped. People say that they didn't feel good, all this kind of stuff.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy to me now that you mentioned that this was on our ballot to fully legalize despite really only having survey type research on it. Like I understand that research facilities are the ones that need it legalized, but to open it up to the streets before we know close to anything about it. I mean we have very few studies, and the one that we have just talked about how it can, within a couple minutes calm your nervous system and help you
Mhm.
produce GABA. I don't know. My disconnect here is why can't they do that with other things? How can they promote something, even inadvertently, even if they're just trying to legalize it? How are they inadvertently promoting that? But they can't promote other areas of holistic health.
Yeah, I think there actually is an interesting connection between those things because, well, the one big difference is there's a lot of holistic health that's legal but not promoted. And psilocybin is not necessarily legal,
Yeah,
but
not
we want
legal.
more research on it.
Hmm.
The only problem is psilocybin has these like huge effects that we're seeing. So
That's
people
true.
get really interested in that and they don't like it's the really exciting things like, oh my gosh, this drug that causes hallucinations might help with PTSD, but
Yeah,
more like
true.
calm, more under
Yeah,
the table drugs like this might help calm and help with PTSD as well,
that's
but it's not
true.
this huge big thing like like a random thing like chamomile or something. I have no idea about herbal
Yeah,
medicine, so
does hawthorn lower blood pressure? Like
right.
it's one of those big, and mental health is such a big problem, and it's unfortunately one of the biggest headliners for problems
Hmm.
recently. Like you've been seeing cholesterol related health information for the past 50 years, but mental health stuff seems to kind of just be now emerging, even though it's something people have dealt with for centuries. So I
Right.
think now this is such a, like you said, a big deal. I don't know. Part of my brain is like, why can't we get a little bit more? Just a little
Yeah,
bit.
it's frustrating. It's like I
Spread
was
the
literally
love, man.
I was just
Sorry.
talking with my postdoc and we were trying to figure out like a master's thesis and we've just been like brainstorming. And he was like, "You know, olfaction is interesting and it's great and I'm studying olfaction. That's what they're studying. But if you're interested in regeneration of the brain, you're gonna be more likely to get funding. You're gonna be more likely to find people who want to work with you. You're gonna be more likely to get papers published because that's what like people know about and it's what sparks like
Mm,
excitement in the research field.
yeah.
So like even though olfaction can have huge ramifications if we study it, it's like, oh no, but could the brain regenerate? Oh my
People want
goodness.
this.
Right.
Yeah.
That's what people
People,
actually
yeah.
want.
That's
And that's what people are
unfortunate.
excited to see. And it's like you can't even until you're running your own lab, you can't really pursue what you actually want to unless you're willing to fight really hard for funding, which is
Yeah.
really difficult.
Or do it out of your own pocket,
Right. Like
which is
the
nearly impossible.
yeah, like the history was saying, like the one of the largest research centers for psychedelic treatment studies has to rely on um gifts and
Grant
donations
money.
because they can't get
Yeah.
funding. So like you can't
Actually, I
even
said
pursue.
grant just now. I meant gifts, and yeah.
Yeah.
They're not getting grants.
Well, they could be getting
Yeah.
private grants, just not
I
public
bet you
grants.
in the next couple years, because of the buzz about the election approving this as a legal substance, I bet
Oh,
they will get more
we didn't
funding.
in Mass.
Oh, we
Did you
didn't
in
either.
Florida? Oh,
Mm-mm.
okay.
No, I don't actually. I don't know how many places did, but I think the fact that it was even present on the ballot will promote, at least I'm betting you the Google searches for it spiked big
Yeah, for
time.
real. The only problem is,
So
I
I
don't know
don't.
about in Florida, but in Massachusetts, if you voted on something and it got declined, you can't vote on it again for like, I think it's like 6 years. So like even if there was more research, we can't vote on legalization. And we didn't we
What? Oh
we
my
weren't
gosh.
legalizing public or consumerism. Like we weren't legalizing it as a consumer product. You could only buy it from like you could only use it in medical
Yeah, like the
circumstances
medical
or
card stuff.
right, but you can't, it's not a consumer product. So like you couldn't sell it like a cannabis dispensary, but you
I
could
think
get it from
that
people
makes
who were
sense for
growing it
now.
legally. Yeah.
That
Yeah,
makes
I
sense
liked
for
that.
right now.
I don't want to talk about other political views on the podcast, but I did vote yes on legalizing non-consumer production of psilocybin.
Yeah, I do think for right now, while it is still a not very well understood product, I think it should be something that you should be allowed to try under proper supervision.
Hmm. Especially for
And then
training medical providers,
yes,
like
yes,
you
because
mentioned
if you
earlier.
if you open it up, like if we know enough about it to know that it is not necessarily a something that kills you on the spot, because it supposedly is fairly difficult to overdose on psilocybin to the point where you die.
Hmm.
And that's from the Federal Drug Administration. So if it's not going to kill you immediately, we don't know whether it's killing you, taking a couple of years off your life or not, or turning you brain dead over,
Right. And
know,
that's where
whatever.
like
But that's where a doctor should be allowed to choose,
right.
and a
And
patient should
that's
be
where
allowed to ask.
yeah, yeah. And that's where like the physiological effects are important as well. Like we're focusing on the neural effects and how it impacts anxiety and depression, but also like some of the research has shown that it impacts renal function. It causes hypertension. It causes vasoconstriction, increased blood pressure. Well, that's what vasoconstriction causes, but increased blood pressure, increased heart rate, like all
Right.
of these physiological effects that might be impacted other than just the neurological relaxation feeling and like the ability to open up on past memories and talk about your trauma.
The spiritual aspect of it too is I have a very interesting group of friends, and majority of it, this is a very what is it called when you have a very concentrated group of certain types of people, so it's not a good diverse opinion.
Like a
You know what I'm
confirmation
talking about?
bias?
Confirmation bias. Thank you. This is very much confirmation biased, but all of them report using it for kind of spiritual awakening. And I think that's another stigma that's on top of it, that people who are not spiritual or not spiritual in that way can use something like this. Even like herbal health in general and supplementation even kind of gets pushed into that same category, and it's really not. An interesting point on the impacts that it might have on you is that we looked into it, and Emma just mentioned the renal function, hypertension, vasoconstriction. That essentially just means that it gives you high blood pressure and it raises your heart rate. And we had a whole discussion before we recorded of how does this work? How does it simultaneously relax your nervous system? We don't know whether it's part of your nervous system, a specific, target point, or the whole thing. How does it raise your blood pressure and raise your heart rate, but put you into almost a vegetative state? We literally have no idea how those are two common side effects, and yet you're calm.
That would have impacts on how you feel. That's not just, oh, my heart rate's a little high. Like that would cause other physiological impacts. If you're, I don't know, microdosing psilocybin every day and your heart rate is 30 beats per minute faster on a daily basis, that can have huge impacts.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's all I
Generally,
want to
you want
say.
to avoid having your heart rate be too high or too low for a long time.
Yeah.
Athletes, like Emma said, almost always have lower heart rates, depends on the type of athletics that you do, and whether or not you have a chronic condition of some kind. That can kick you right in the butt. But anyways, oh yeah, chronic conditions that are unrelated to certain neurological disorders or mental health disorders probably should not be using this in general, because we know little to nothing about that. And we have one reported case of renal failure,
Acute kidney injury.
acute kidney injury, my bad, using psilocybin. That's one. Whether or not she had some kind of other problems going on as well, no idea. But still, just be careful to only use it for the things that it has been cited to do. So use the original study that we said to draw some conclusions from that. Obviously, this is not medical advice in the slightest, and neither are the studies. But since this is not a medically controlled substance, we can pretty much say whatever we want about it, which is partially unfortunate. Just be careful. understand how it affects your body to the best of your abilities before trying to use it, especially if it does get legalized to the point where you can buy it wherever, or if you're buying it from wherever right now. Be careful, be aware of what it does and what it might be able to do, and maybe consider writing about how it helps you or doesn't help you so other people can see it.
I'll take it. I will make a research paper and I will write you as a co-author. I won't do that.
This
But yeah,
user on Twitter said,
yeah.
never mind. Never
Don't
mind.
just take this and be like, oh, okay, now I'm gonna try or not try psilocybin. Advocate for research on substances that we don't have enough medical research on, especially if people are making broad statements about how it can impact your body. Advocate for research. Don't just be satisfied with the way things are.
And that's about where that stands. So the answer to the question to trip or not to trip is a fat maybe, I guess. Trip safely, trip slowly.
Trip
Don't
with a
trip
psychiatric
daily.
professional.
Oh yeah, don't trip. Yeah, yeah.
Thank you everyone for tuning in. We had so much fun creating this episode, and we hope you enjoy it as much as we do.
If you'd like to learn more, follow us on Instagram at studentsparks.ep, where we'll post all kinds of information and episode updates.
Don't forget to check in every other week to learn more about what it is like to be a student of neuroscience
And naturopathy.